This is Radio Health Journal. I'm Reed Pence. This week, what happens to the mind and body when we spring ahead every year?
There's been some evidence now that possibly the risk of heart attack stays elevated during the duration that we are on daylight savings time.
More than just an hour of lost sleep when Radio Health Journal returns.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
But those small businesses, in the aggregate, are 50% of all jobs and 45% of GDP. It's about half the economy.
One economist's theories on post-pandemic America. Then,
it was a life lived much closer to the bone than the more comfortable life that you encounter in the middle class in the suburbs.
Exploring the oil fields of rural North Dakota. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
To a lot of us, sleep is an important commodity. That makes next weekend one of the least favorite times of the year for millions of people. Most of the country goes on daylight saving time next Sunday. And as we spring ahead 1 hour on the clock, we lose a precious hour of sleep, an hour that many of us really can't spare.
There's been some studies that show that up to 40% of us don't get enough sleep. And NIH studies show that translates to somewhere between 50 to 70 million people.
That's Dr. Michael Jaffe, Vice Chair of the Department of Neurology at the University of Florida. He says not getting the requisite 7 hours of sleep per night has all kinds of bad effects, starting with the brain.
We certainly need sleep for optimal cognitive functioning, for everything from our reaction time, what some people call our reflexes, to being able to process new memories of things that we're learning, both how to do things and facts and figures that we need to kind of keep in mind, and certainly our ability to perform and make sort of more complex executive decisions and shift from one topic to another.
One way of thinking about the effects of short sleep on the brain is how alcohol affects the brain. So some of the effects are very similar.
Dr. Muhammad Adil Rishi is a pulmonary critical care and sleep physician at the Mayo Clinic Health System and vice chair of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine Public Safety Committee.
Often the person who is short on sleep himself is not aware of the deficiencies when they're performing tasks. It kind of rings that bell, with somebody who's buzzed when they've taken a few drinks and want to drive. This reduced sleep has been associated with increased risk of motor vehicle accidents as well as accidents at work.
Obviously, you also feel tired when you haven't had enough sleep, but Rishi says that's just the start of its effects on the body.
Short sleep time is associated with obesity. It's obviously been associated with physical inactivity because if you're tired, you're not going to be very active. Short sleepers have increased rates of heart attack and coronary artery disease, stroke, asthma, COPD, even cancer.
And it's even worse if you live on the western edge of a time zone. Those people see the sun set an hour later, get less sleep, and have more health impacts than those on the eastern edge of a time zone. And on top of all of this, now a nation of people who are already sleep-deprived is about to lose 1 more hour of sleep next weekend. The effects the next few days after we spring ahead can be dramatic and sometimes tragic.
So many of us are already starting off sleep-deprived. If we go into a springtime daylight savings time where we lose another hour, there can be some more immediate repercussions for those first several days. In some cases, it can be increased time off from work. There can be increased mistakes made with productivity. And certainly, there's been studies that show there's an increase in motor vehicle accidents that can happen as a result of fatigue or inattentiveness while driving.
There's increased risk of accidents at work. There's also increased risk of heart attacks. More recently, over the last couple of years, there's been an association between this switch and increased risk of this abnormal rhythm of the heart called atrial fibrillation.
Most people figure they get over the switch to daylight saving time within a few days, but research is showing that's not always the case. Some people have a harder time adjusting than others, and some never do.
There is some catch-up sleep that happens in the first week. And to some extent, there is some adaptation. But, the more we have studied this, especially in the last several years, more we have found that the adaptation is certainly by no means complete. So we don't completely adapt to the change. And so there's been some evidence now that possibly the risk of heart attack stays elevated during the duration that we are on daylight savings time.
Daylight sets the body clock, and we can't change that. But when our body clocks are out of sync with the clock on the wall, it produces profound effects. That's what happens during daylight saving time. It's called social jet lag, and Rishi says we suffer from it until we finally go back to standard time.
This social jet lag has been associated with increased risk of obesity, increased risk of high blood pressure, and increased risk of, a fancy term called metabolic syndrome, which is just a fancy doctor way of saying increased risk of high blood pressure, obesity, and diabetes. And so certainly I think the adaptation is not complete, and we continue to suffer some of these harmful effects through the duration of the daylight savings time.
The switch back to standard time in the fall isn't nearly as hard on our bodies. We gain back an hour of sleep and adjust the time so it's back in sync with our body clocks. But few people like that time change either, according to Dr. Steve Hankey, professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University.
Only about 28% of the people in the United States like the way it's set up, going from daylight saving to standard a couple of times a year. 31% actually prefer to have daylight savings all year round and never switch it, and 40% would like to have standard time all year round and do away with the daylight savings switch.
There's little disagreement at this point that the switches are bad. I think everybody agrees that the switches are not good, and a lot of states have either passed legislation or have pending legislation either in favor of daylight savings time or in favor of standard time. Some states have competing legislations at the same time. But in the end, to go to either, daylight saving time permanently across the country or standard time would require an act of Congress. The way the law is written right now, you cannot go to permanent daylight savings time. You can go to permanent standard time. And in fact, the states of Arizona and Hawaii do have permanent standard time year-round, so they're lucky that they don't switch the clocks twice a year.
But if we get rid of time switching each spring and fall, that means making a choice between year-round standard time or year-round daylight saving time. Jaffe says each has its fans.
Some of the states that rely on tourism in particular, they tend to favor more of a permanent daylight savings time to get more sort of tourist time and attract more people to all the things that they have to offer. Whereas certain environmentalists who favor less energy consumption and certain religious groups whose prayer times might be really linked to sun up and sundown, and some education advocates who are concerned about transporting kids to school in the dark, they tend to prefer more of a permanent standard time if we were to kind of go to one time.
Daylight saving time didn't even exist before World War I, when it was invented to save energy on lights at night. But Jaffe says now?
I don't think it's as true today as it once was, in that when it first went into effect, if people were out and about, they weren't using electricity and lights in their homes. But in our modern era, with our computers and our other electronic devices and with modern air conditioning, I don't think that the energy savings really is what it might have once been.
The myth persists that daylight saving time was also created with rural America in mind. But Rishi says farmers don't like daylight saving time. Their animals follow solar time, which is closer to standard time. But it's not as if we haven't tried year-round daylight saving time before. Rishi says it didn't work out well.
We, here in the United States, adopted permanent daylight savings time in 1973 when the OPEC countries put an oil embargo on the United States and allies during the Arab-Israeli war. And so it started in January of 1974 and was supposed to run into 1975 by law. But it was so unpopular that within a few months, so I think in October, that those plans were abandoned and went back to standard time.
The biggest reason daylight saving time year-round was unpopular, Rishi says, is that when winter came around, children were in danger walking to school.
There was increased episodes of kids dying when going to school early in the morning. So you remember, when you go to daylight savings time in the summer, what you do is you prolong the sunlight in the evenings. But what a lot of people forget is that what that means is that you have more darkness in the morning. So that's obviously an issue during the summer, but that issue becomes even more severe when you have daylight savings time in the winter. Especially in the northern states, the darkness in the morning can last till 9 o'clock in the morning. That's the time when these kids are traveling to school. Remember, not all kids go to school in their school buses. A lot of the kids, especially in our rural communities, would walk to school. And that's where they probably get into trouble, going to school early in the morning.
The American Academy of Sleep Medicine says we should go to year-round standard time. They say health reasons alone justify sticking with a clock that's more like solar time. But a few experts like Hanky say if you want to have time that's more like solar time, get rid of time zones completely.
Every place in the world should be setting its clocks and its watches at the same time, which would be Greenwich Mean Time.
At the tone, 19 hours, 1 minute, Coordinated Universal Time.
Greenwich Mean Time, or Universal Time, is what the clock says in London, England. It's 5 hours ahead of Eastern Time and 8 hours ahead of Pacific Time. Pilots and stock traders already use it routinely. But if everyone in the world were on Universal Time, someone in Los Angeles might be getting up with the sun with their watch reading 2 in the afternoon. The sun would be directly overhead at 8 p.m., and most people would be getting to bed every night with a clock reading 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. In other words, the clock on the wall would be so far off that it would be irrelevant. And that's sort of the idea.
That would do away with the time zones, and then everyone would adjust to the sun, by the way, and essentially go back to what we had pre-clock time, or even pre-sundial time, when everyone went by the sun. People got up when the sun rose. They went to bed shortly after the sun went down, and midday was, midday when the sun was up in the middle of the sky. And then you had none of these distortions between watches and clocks and the circadian rhythm, your biological clock.
Hanky says the world is going so fast that such a change is inevitable. The only question is when. But others like Rishi aren't so sure.
It makes no sense at all. So there would be a cost to be paid, and we are already paying that cost in terms of increased accidents, increase of poor learning ability in our kids, and in terms of metabolic syndrome. And only God knows, what harmful effects can happen when you completely disregard the sun clock, right? When you completely dissociate yourself from the sun clock and go to this kind of made-up time.
So while a lot of people would like us to stop going back and forth with the clock a couple of times a year, there's less agreement about whether standard time or daylight saving time is the better place to land. And now we know it makes a difference for a lot more than just a few days. You can find out more about all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. I'm Reed Pence.
Two nationwide surveys find that discrimination is a significant barrier to care for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. Half or more of non-white Alzheimer's caregivers report they face discrimination in navigating health care for their recipient. Dr. Carl V. Hill is Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer of the Alzheimer's Association.
The data suggests we have a long way to go to address lack of health equity in healthcare. More than 80% of non-white racial and ethnic groups say it's important for Alzheimer's care providers to understand their backgrounds and experiences. But fewer than half of Blacks and only about 60% of Hispanics and Asian Americans feel confident about their access to culturally competent providers.
The surveys also reveal a lack of trust among Blacks in research clinical trials, and half doubt that advances in Alzheimer's treatments would be shared. These findings are part of the 2021 Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures report. Find out more at alz.org/facts.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Radio Health Journal is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.
Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
Certainly by the end of the summer, and I really have reasonably high hopes that we can have a near normal Thanksgiving.
Okay, I'm vaccinated. Now what? Can I finally get rid of my mask?
Then breaking the stigma of epilepsy.
We, over the centuries, have been burned alive. We've been called possessed by the devil. 25% of this country thinks that people with epilepsy shouldn't be allowed to get married.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.